I think I'm going to go with the Shamal just
Oh,
because it's like I think most people can agree that if you spend long enough looking at a quattroporte, you're like, yeah, okay, like I get this. There's a lot of subtlety to it. There is zero subtlety to the Shamal. It's just like Gandini grabbed his bag of tricks and went boom,
bang.
and it's mental. Hello, I'm Drew Smith, storyteller and strategist that started out as a car designer, now working independently at Studio Fro.
And I'm Joe Simpson, a design strategist for an automotive OEM in Europe, whose views I do not and have never represented on this show.
And welcome to episode 17 of Looking Out the Podcast, in which we connect the dots between automobility, design, and culture.
And coming up on the show this week, we're going to talk about one of the greats of car design who, since we were last on air, has passed away. We're going to touch on the new BMW Neue Klasse X. And Drew, what else are we going to talk about on the show tonight?
Knobs.
Knobs. That's it. I'd forgotten. We're going to talk about knobs, buttons, and screens. Thank you. Buckle in, folks. It's going to be a fun one.
And, surprise, audience participation. Joe has no idea what we're going to be talking about. But before we get stuck in, Joe, I believe... I'm going to try and superimpose a dunce hat on you because you made a fairly fundamental error in your mathematics in the last show. Do you want to own up to this?
So when I went on a bit of a high horse about how much money Apple could or could not have made on a hypothetical car that they might or might not have been making and now definitely aren't, and how much the auto industry makes, I might have got some of my fundamental maths about profit margin quite wrong. Let's not go into the details of that. I'd prefer to gloss over it. Let's just say maths was never my strong point. Needed a tutor to scrape through an A-level. But suffice to say that phones are far more profitable than cars. And I think the fundamental point I made still broadly stands. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that'll do the job. So to the very kind person on Threads who pointed out this fundamental error, thank you so much.
Monumental.
Monumental, fundamental, elemental. It's all of those things. We hope that has addressed that issue for you. Moving swiftly onwards, since we last recorded, one of the greats of automotive design, Marcello Gandini, has passed away. And we thought that it might be fun. Well, I thought it might be fun. I landed this on Joe right before we recorded.
3 minutes ago.
Yeah. If we played a game of Top Trumps, Marcello Gandini Top Trumps, where Joe and I get to choose our favorite Gandini concept car, our favorite Gandini production car, and our favorite Gandini wild card. So, Joe.
What's first? Concept car?
Concept car.
Okay. I'm really struggling, and I have until this moment been trying to decide which one, but I'm going to go for the Stratos Zero. The Lancia. Ooh. The brown one.
Obvious.
The one that to some people
really
might look
obvious.
like a wedge of cheese. It's a very, very, very obvious one, but, if you've seen those pictures of it being driven through the streets of Turin, you will know exactly why I have chosen that car.
Okay. I mean, there is a lot to love about the Stratos. Like, it is a sheer, like a piece of sheer what the fuckery. Like, you just look at it and you're like,
yeah,
how does that even work? Oh,
how do
you
people
walk
get in
up
it?
the hood to get into it. and then you realize that it's got like a dinky little, Lancia V4 in the back. I think it's a V4, isn't it?
I believe
mean,
so. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, this was one of the funny things about
I'm now looking
like a lot of
on the internet.
Gandini's concept designs
Yes,
is
before.
like you didn't even really care what was in it engine wise.
What powered
because
them?
you were
No.
you were just like, where is this from? It should have like a proton jet.
Go on then. How are
Okay.
you going to top trump me?
Oh, so I started off by looking at the the Camargue. I was looking at the Camargue, and then I was looking at the Tundra, and I'm like, wow, this theme got rolled out quite a few times, didn't it?
There's a theme that happened with not just Gandini. I think
It felt like it reached its peak, and I don't know which order. I think the Sibilio was not the last, but it felt like that theme reached its absolute peak with the Sibilio, which is the strange brown Lancia with the frosted brown glass. It looks, actually, I'm going to say this, it looks like a polished turd, but in the best possible way. Like it is
Slightly
such a
wedged
strange car. But I decided not to go down that path because there were just sort of too many of them. And I realized that Gandini actually designed the Apple car that Apple never designed. The Lamborghini Bravo. It is such a beautifully pure, wonderfully geometric little thing. Like there's no muss, no fuss, extremely stripped back, and a little bit like you seeing images of the Stratos Zero being driven down the streets. I seem to remember on YouTube, I'll see if I can find it and cut it into the video. There's footage of the Bravo driving through kind of, mist-enveloped elm trees in some rural part of Italy. And it's just kind of one of those images. You see it and you're like, oh, yeah. So here's the thing. You look at the Bravo, right? And it's a 1974 car. It is so pure that if somebody came out with it today, you'd be like, yeah, okay. I mean, the wheels kind of give it away a little bit, but...
Yeah, but I think this is a good point, though, Drew. We have to say it's a statement of bleeding obvious, but both Gandini and Giugiaro, I think what they did, particularly in the 70s, is I don't know what I'm trying to think of a comparison to another industry, but they didn't just put car design on the map. They completely reinvented what we thought you could do with cars and car design, and they made, particularly in the concepts, but there are, as we're about to talk about, plenty of production cars, I think, that also just we don't get close to the ingenuity, the innovation, even though it's such a buzzword these days, or the kind of, the sort of the originality today.
Yes. 100%.
So, it really, those two figures, I think, really changed the face of car design over a couple of decades, and really made it a thing, and probably were responsible for many boyhood dreams of becoming a car designer, I think.
There's something really interesting in what you've just said there. Before we move on to the production cars, there's a great little interview with Chris Bangle that was conducted by Car Design News, James McLaughlin of Car Design News at the Geneva Motor Show. And they were talking, or Chris was talking about how once upon a time, and he was referring to Patrick Lequemont and the idea of the monovolume, and how when Patrick was leading design at Renault, Patrick essentially took the monovolume into pretty much every category possible. And people were like, oh, that's cool. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And Chris is like, if you try and do that these days, people are going to say, that's weird. That's so strange. And yet none of Gandini's cars would have existed in the modern context, because everybody would be like, that's weird. That's
bananas,
really weird. Speaking of weird, I will go next with my production car.
Go on then.
Because it's a weird choice. And I'm going to kind of provide some context for this by saying, not that long ago, I contributed a little bit to an article that Sam Livingston wrote about rightness or just rightness in car
just
design.
right car design. Yeah.
And one of the things that I said was just right car design is something that I feel, right? There's a physical sort of manifestation in my body that makes me kind of go, ooh, okay.
It's a gut reaction.
There's a real gut reaction to it. Now, I may have undone myself a little bit with this choice because there are people that will probably claim that it's not a great piece of just right car design. But for me, every time I look at a Lamborghini Espada, I get a very strange feeling in my lower body. Like it is just so...
I want to know. Just talk about the Espada.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Not the feelings in your body. People don't need to know about them.
It's like inside voice, Drew. Inside voice.
Tittering.
Just look at it. Look at it. I mean, as a way to package a V12 and 4 big seats and a shitload of glass, like it is just...
And there was this thing as well with glass and the technology that was of the time and they were exploring, because the concept car I nearly chose the Marcello, because the Marcello had like such a lasting impact on me the first time I saw it. I can still deeply remember the first time I saw it. And
I had a Matchbox Marcello.
Oh, I'm jealous. But I've always, since then, I've had a thing for cars that had basically a window line that kind of ran below the belt line. And I think the exploration of glass and the idea of being able to see the people in the vehicle and the people being able to see the road is kind of incredible. And I think, I would say that the Espada, as you say, for me, it's all about that sort of glass house volume. It's incredible.
And to come back to that idea of like cars are things in which we want to see ourselves. Like the Espada is something that I look at, and I've never been in one, but I've seen people drive them, and it's almost, I almost imagine it's like sitting in a low slung Range Rover, right?
Yes,
and you're just crossing continents in a glass house, and there's something fundamentally very appealing about that. Anyway, over to you, production car.
Right. Can I have 2?
You're looking up the Wikipedia page, aren't you?
No, I have got various things open in the background. I'm just trying to decide. The thing is, I wanted to talk about the Garmisch, which is not a production Gandini design.
No. Sorry, you lose.
I actually then was going to choose the E12 5 Series because I think, and I wanted to talk a bit about the Garmisch, but I won't because you've just told me I can't. But the translation, BMW obviously started out with, the 2002, that's the kind of, I suppose, the archetype BMW. And the way that BMW-ness in those sort of early days was transferred into a larger format vehicle and developed with that, the nose, the Hofmeister King, the proportion of again, for me, a lot of it's about glass, the glass house to the body. And then the way that, I don't know, the 5 Series, it just sort of, what are we at now? The sort of 8th generation 5 Series. I think it's such a kind of like a landmark car. And I've always wanted an E12 5 Series. So, I think for me, it's that one. Even though I'm picking really obvious choices.
I don't know. I mean, there may be a lot of people out there that wouldn't know that the E12 was designed by Gandini. And I think, as you say, like,
would just choose
a Countach.
I was just going to say a Countach or a Miura would be the obvious ones, but I nearly went for the Renault, the Renault 5, but we talked about it last week.
But only
so
as a baccarat.
That's him. Yeah. Yes.
All right. Wildcard, Joe.
Wild card for me, it's a really easy one. It's the Renault Magnum. I absolutely love the Renault Magnum. It's my favorite truck of all time. It was my favorite truck for a long time before I even found out it was a Gandini design. I remember being in France as a kid in the back of my dad's Volkswagen Golf and seeing one of these for the first time and just being like, oh my God, what is that? And what I love about the Magnum is that it's like a piece of architecture. And
yes,
some people know I started out in architecture, and it's just so it's so decisive. It's so clear. And I think the thing that I really love about it is it's got enormous presence. And yet I've always found it to have this sort of level of approachability. If we talk about a character, it's not a scary truck. It's just a incredibly imposing, confident truck.
Yes.
And I love it.
So those sorts of cab over trucks when I was a kid in Australia were absolutely not the norm, right? So it was we were sort of like Max and Kenworths,
right?
Sort of hood out front, with the cab at the back,
hood out front
type thing. Yeah, and I, a little bit like you, the first time I ever went to Europe and seeing European trucks and seeing what I now know is the Magnum.
Yeah,
it's a deeply impressive piece of design. Absolutely stunning. Okay,
what's yours?
I've got two later career choices here, and I'm struggling to decide between the Quattroporte 4 and the Shamal.
And I feel like this is a conversation you need Owen Reedy in.
And I think I'm going to go with the Shamal just because it's like, I think most people can agree that if you spend long enough looking at a Quattroporte, you're like, yeah, okay, like I get this. There's a lot of subtlety to it. There is zero subtlety to the Shamal. It's just like Gandini grabbed his bag of tricks and went, boom,
bang.
And it's mental. Like it is, from like whacking a Lambo arch on it to the little spoiler at the base of the windshield, the way the projector beams have been kind of sectioned off by a plastic cover from, the high beams, I'm guessing they are, but behind they're just the same lens. Like it has this real sense of, we've not got a lot of money to work with. How can we make this thing go? And I think, I just think it shows the versatility of the man.
Still got that rear wheel arch as well.
Do you reckon like he just, like a brief came in and they gave him the package and he just like drew the slash and then handed it to the understudies and said, okay, like you fill in the gaps.
I feel there's some stuff, if anybody's not read Patrick Lecompt's book, no, he's written a couple now, but the blue one, is it Design in Mind? Anyway, the one where he talks largely about his kind of career at Renault, he doesn't name people by name, but I know he has tremendous respect for Gandini. But I think there are points which he references, probably which would have coincided with later in Gandini's career, where he's kind of like irritation at the sort of almost regurgitation of ideas that we've previously seen becomes a bit clear.
Yeah, and let me be clear,
I think
like
that might be a bit going on here.
The Shamal is not a classically pretty car. I'd go so far as to say it is not a pretty car, but it's a very interesting example of late Gandini oeuvre, shall we say?
I think you're getting a look into our kind of respective weird brains here, listeners and viewers. I feel like it's a very Drew Smith choice.
So, on that note, shall we talk about knobs or shall we talk about the BMW
can we
Vision
talk about
Neue
BMW?
Klasse X? Yes.
Can we talk about BMW? Because I want to do a kind of a real shoehorn of a segue from Gandini into the BMW Neue Klasse X, which I hope
it's all about the Garmisch.
It is all about the Garmisch. I feel like people will send me hate mail and stuff for this, but one of the things that I can see BMW doing, and we talked about the Neue Klasse sedan when that was shown in Munich last year.
Munich, yeah.
And how we both felt this was kind of like a signs of life at BMW and some, yes, okay, we could be critical and say there's some clumsy bits, but there's also some very good bits and a real exploration of kind of some new proportions and kind of how you keep BMW-ness in the electric age. One of the things that was clear on that car was that BMW were working on this new face. BMW's face has been the source of, shall we say, a bit of discussion, debate. Yes, reference to various sort of animals, with the growth of the twin kidneys, and the abandonment of the kind of round lights. And I think a lot of people have been very unhappy with that. And BMW are obviously have been trying to develop things and move things on for the digital age. I felt that the digital bar with the lamps and the kidneys was relatively successful on the Neue Klasse. And I think what's interesting about the Neue Klasse X, this new SUV concept, which for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's essentially like a electric Neue Klasse X3, is that they developed the face. I feel that this is closer to production than the sedan was, and they have downsized the kidneys. They're still quite prominent. They're now very upright. They're vertical rather than horizontal, and they're flanked by a pair of digital light units. And I feel that, and I know people will disagree with me, that it's actually done quite successfully. Cover up the lower area. If you look at this car head on, the lower is not helping. But that upper mask of the face, I feel, is actually getting to something that is quite interesting as a kind of new BMW identity. And I felt that maybe they'd been looking a bit at the Garmisch, because what happens there is you have the kidneys in a kind of, again, quite architectural way, almost chewing through the face. You have the kind of sharp nose, angled nose, and then you have, and it was one of the, only BMWs at the time, it was interesting, Gandini's sort of exploration of it, where they had already set the die with the round lamps. Yeah. And he took that away, and he put the lamp projectors behind this, these kind of fairings, these plastic fairings, a bit like almost like a Citroen SM. Yeah. And I think that BMW are kind of riffing off that a bit here for their new face, and I would say, from my perspective, it's actually quite successful. It looks like a BMW. It looks new. But it's also distinct and identifiable. I want to ask what you think as well. But the other thing I would like to say about it is that I really appreciate the way they are obviously really working with their glass house and going away from the ever smaller, tiny gun slit glass turret on top of a massively thick body. And we saw on the Vision sedan that there was this visual break at the belt line and the glass went under it. We all sort of thought, that's very concepty, because you can't actually drop a window glass with that setup. So how will they do that? Well, I think here they're showing us what they're going to do. They're sort of visually, the glass house is biting into the body side, but it's done in quite a sort of, I think, relatively refined way. And as a result, we get quite a big, airy glass house. And you can see from the pictures inside, it really helps in terms of the feeling that obviously BMW, I think, want to create on board these new Neue Klasse vehicles, which is of a kind of like airy lightness. And I'm here for that. I think we need that in car design, and especially in the context of ever harder crash regulation, where it's harder and harder to do bigger areas of glass and slim pillars, they should be applauded for trying this. But what do you think?
Well, so the first thing that came to mind when I was looking at the press images and there was a profile pic, was that it took me back to the first generation X5, the E53, which was BMW's first sports activity vehicle. It was not an SUV; it was an SAV.
They still refer to them as that.
Precisely because of the volume of glass, it lends, particularly against a backdrop of ever decreasing glass to body ratio, it lends this incredible sense of modernity. And I dropped in our message last night an image of Philip Johnson's glass house. And that's what this car feels like as a result. It's just like it's this breath of fresh air. You just go,
yeah.
Oh, as long as you don't look at the lower front. On the front, one of the things that occurs to me is whether, and I don't know. Now that I'm about to say it, I'm not sure how this would work strategically, but because the horizontal configuration that they have on the Neue Klasse sedan and iVision D, where they developed a little bit further, it suits a BMW sedan format so well. Mm-hmm. Whereas I'm wondering whether actually the teeth, the vertical kidneys, become a hallmark for the SUVs. It would just be an interesting way of delineating the
different vehicle types.
The different vehicle types. The most interesting thing for me, though, is the interior.
Yes.
First of all, the color and material choices on the interior are absolutely delightful. I enormously dislike screens, but I have to say the way they've sort of played with different perceptions of cowl height across the IP surfaces is really, really interesting. And they've integrated that full width.
This setup that we talked about in the Neue class, where it's a projected, I think it's a Continental technology, and it's a slim projection basically at the base of the screen that goes from pillar to pillar.
But the real reason I love the interior is because they've finally made in-car cushions that don't look gack.
Yes,
they have really lovely little cushions on the back seat.
Because Drew, you were a massive fan of the cushions that were in the XM, weren't you? Not.
Or like the little scrota, is that like plural of scrotum? The little scrota that sit on the headrests of a Maybach? No.
Oh, yes, you're a particular fan of those, yeah.
These are delightful. I mean, I would quite happily have these cushions in my living room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would completely concur. The colour material is great. People who know me know I'm a bit of a fan of orange. So for me, it's a kind of home run. It's orange and white. Yep, I'll take that. But I really, yes, I love this kind of like development of this kind of cord and this this kind of like graphic that's kind of woven into it, and the use of fundamentally just joyful colours. It was yellow in the sedan. It's orange here. They've been really doing quite a good job anyway. I think if you've been in an iX, say what you like about the exterior, the interior is extremely good, and the colour and material options available in that car are really, really very progressive, but still feel very premium. Let's see what the production car is like. I'm curious to see how this screen setup transitions to production, and just how close or not this might be to a production car. Certainly in silhouette, to me, it feels very close.
And will the window switches feel better than a Dacia's? We'll find out.
$1 million question.
$1 million question. Speaking of switches, shall we talk about Euro NCAPs? Well, it's not really a mandate, is it? It's an enticement to manufacturers to put more physical controls back into their vehicles.
Yes. So for those who aren't nerding out on the latest news, what this was a Euro NCAP announcing that come 2026, if you don't have physical controls for the horn, the indicators, the hazard switch, what was it? I think it was the defogger. There were 5 things that they mandated: the horn, and then the gear shifter.
Right.
That you would lose a star on the official Euro NCAP crash rating, which goes up to 5 stars, which obviously most modern cars are achieving 5 stars on. I think this follows on from how Euro NCAP, who are obviously there to kind of try to drive all manufacturers and Europe's roads towards safer cars, fewer deaths, fewer injuries, started out with passive crash testing. How did the car behave in various crash scenarios? Offset barriers, side impact, side pole, and then have migrated so that the rating is made up of the physical crash, pedestrian impact, like child rear seat safety, and then importantly, the ADAS systems, and they do assessment of the ADAS systems. So now they're moving towards physical controls. There's obviously recognition that, people are getting distracted in cars. People are taking their eyes off the road. They don't want that to happen. And so the mandate to put back in some kind of physical controls for these things. What's your take?
So I've just written an article inspired by this, which will be coming out in the next edition of Interior Motives, I believe. And we'll also, there'll be a slightly longer version of the article coming up on Car Design News as well. And rather than addressing, I guess, the specific safety aspect, which for me is sort of a no-brainer, and I think there's also an open question as to how tough this incentive is and how much change it will actually drive. But my reflection for Interior Motives really centered on what we lost when we took buttons away. And I know that there are, good reasons, i.e. cost, for centralizing everything on a screen, right? There's no doubt that it's cheaper to engineer one BFS than it is to engineer a whole bunch of buttons. But in taking away things that we can turn, things that we can push, things that we can pull, we've taken away a channel for brand communication, essentially. And one of the canonical examples for me of this is the seat control in the W140 and the R129 Mercedes, and the fact that the memory buttons, so memory positions 1, 2, and 3, have a different radius on them to the memory set button, so you can feel the difference just with your fingers. The memory set button is also a different color. It's a green color compared to the black of all the other ones. And that says so much about how Mercedes at that point in time thought about the relationship between their customer and their car.
Yeah.
There's a lot of character that can be delivered through haptic interfaces that you just don't get through this. And yeah, like Porsche might put some little sort of vibrating motor behind a panel of glossy black plastic, but it's not the same as the rubbery knobs that sat on the binnacle of a 928, for example. And so yeah, I'd love to see this as an opportunity to bring some of that haptic character back to interiors, because especially as the powertrain becomes increasingly commoditized, as Sergio Marchionne said in Confessions of a Capital Junkie, like the thing that customers care about is the in-vehicle experience. Like, how do you make that more sensory?
I think what you're highlighting is that it's a fundamentally important part of car design, which we are sort of throwing away. If car design is at a fundamental level about creating meaning beyond the kind of basic functionality, and a lot of what Chris Bangle talks about in terms of the character of the object, much of that occurs through the way that when you interact with something, it behaves, and then how you feel. And I would take two examples. One would be the way that Audi in the sort of through the late 90s and then into the sort of 2000s drove up the premium perception of its cars almost entirely through perceived quality, which largely was to do with the way the interior was put together, but in no small part was to do with the way that what happened when you pressed or turned something. So the way that, Audi, I think it might have been Saab that did it first, but Audi with the damped cup holders, the way that when you pressed a cup holder and it popped out of the dashboard and then sort of unfolded and then slowed itself and turned. Yeah.
The 9.5 cup holder.
The 9.5 cup holder, the best cup holder ever invented. Or the way that, Audi's, the way that they had knobs, and it was the fact that they used knurled aluminium or kind of like a chrome finish, and it felt cold. That was one thing. But then when you turned them, it didn't just spin in this kind of like cheap way. It was damped, it was notched. The way you were interacting with it felt precise, and that drove the perceived quality. The other example I give is Porsche, and Porsche, I think, famously, if anyone has driven a Porsche will immediately know this, Porsches have kind of long-standing appeal largely because of the way they drive. And the way they drive is typically sort of characterized as the engine, the sound, the response, the acceleration, the handling, the steering. But it's also the way that the door opens, the way that the indicators and the control weights, the way that, in the more modern ones even, the switches on the steering wheel for adjusting the setting, the way that they move and function. Porsches have this consistency of control and interaction, which makes the thing a delight to interact with and use. Everything is sort of weighted and metered just so, and it's kind of all choreographed together. I think those are great examples of what you're saying.
I was amazed to note the consistency in, I'm going to use the word viscosity, may not be the right term, and feel of the indicator stalk in my 928 and my dad's KN.
Yeah.
It's like...
Yeah. Right.
This is delightful. So yes, I think there is... and brands built, whether consciously or not, there was so much equity in the various types of haptic controls that brands had developed over time, and I think it feels like the only one I can think of now that still really exists that has this kind of cultural resonance is the organ stop on a Rolls Royce.
Yeah, on the Bentley.
For controlling the vent. So I think there's an interesting opportunity here for sort of interior designers and control designers and HMI designers to start thinking, how do we start to build some of that character back in? Because there's no character in these.
I do think that there's a kind of caveat around it, which sits around. We got here because of the number of functions and things that need to be controlled now can't be done through knobs and buttons and dials.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to call bullshit on that. I'm going to call bullshit on that because I'm not saying, like, let's go back to the days of the E38 where it looked like somebody had literally just tipped a bucket of buttons on the dashboard. But I find it fascinating that Hyundai and Hyundai Motor Group, it seems, has doubled down on a core set of hard controls, certainly in the Kia vehicles, and I know this is definitely the case in the Ioniq 5 because they're putting more buttons back in. and this is the other point that I make in the article. Buttons make the value of the vehicle that we have paid for legible. It makes the value of the vehicle more easily accessible. If we can see them, if we can push them, if we can interact with them, like I'm getting what I paid for. And so I'm not saying let's go back to the old days. I am saying, like, what is a suite of hard controls that we can own and develop our own unique haptic identity around?
Yep, I think it's a good question. I was merely trying to raise the issue of, I think we're in the world a bit like original iDrive, where when iDrive came in, and the reason for iDrive was famous was like that E38 was the tipping point. It's like, we can't put more buttons on the dashboard. There's too many things to control. And you went to the round controller, and I think it had one button next to it. And it was criticized, but it was a new interaction model. And then over time, BMW added shortcuts and extra buttons around it. And now they have, I think, actually on that sort of, in things like the 5 Series and stuff, they have more. And I think we're in that period now where we've gone to screens and we've taken the buttons away. And I think some brands are starting to already put them back. I think there's questions around what are the most obvious choices for hard buttons, knobs, what do you need? Yep. And then the point that you're trying to make, which is a really important one, is how do you really think about how that works, how that feels, how that represents your brand, how can they all sing together and in the way that someone's operating the vehicle feel consistently and of your brand. I think that's the opportunity you're really pointing out. But I don't think it's quite as easy as some people are suggesting, and I'm not entirely sure that the Euro NCAP way is, as you have highlighted, I'm not entirely sure it's where it's getting us.
Yeah.
In the final, kind of first instances.
Final point on this thing: the Vision Neue Klasse X has no iDrive controller. So, right.
Interesting.
Final topic. This is audience participation from the much beloved Michael Banofsky. And his question was, actually, I'm going to have to look it up.
I have Michael no Banofsky. Foresight of this question. So you're going to get a very...
The best gas station food you have ever had.
Okay. In the UK, there is a... well, I mean, I've lost it already, haven't I? True, you win.
Top all right, this podcast is over.
Right. There's a services in Cumbria, in the Lake District, just on your way, almost on the Scottish border, called T-Bay. As you head on the west side of the country up through the lake, very beautiful area. And it is basically an independently run service station, and it sits in the most beautiful environment. And basically, it's a kind of farm shop and service station, and you can get the most amazing meat pies and the most amazing sort of butchered. I don't think it's on site, but sort of like hand butchered, independent meat of your choice, and it's. When I used to live in the UK, whenever I went to Scotland, where I used to live, it was kind of like, where you're going to Scotland, it's like, do you want to go one side of the country or do you want to go the other? I always went that way so I could stop there because it was wonderful. And there was a moment I once stopped on the way back where they have this enormous, on one side, on the south side carriageway, they have this enormous kind of picture window. It's about as wide as like, twice the size of my house, and you look out over this kind of
looks out over a pond.
Yeah, a pond, and then like a kind of mountain, and it's just like sit there, eat some, cow that's probably been wandering around the field next door, kind of a few months earlier. It's fantastic. So that's my one. There's probably others in Italy and things that I can think of, but that's the one that come to mind.
So I have enjoyed a couple of extremely good full English breakfasts at T-Bay services on drives back from, is it back from Scotland? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, up to Scotland. Back.
Anyway.
Anyway.
It's on both sides of the carriageway, so you can,
it could have been both.
Yeah.
So for me, I had to think about this one. There was a time when I was living in Germany and I was working for a little design strategy consultancy outside Frankfurt called Carmen. And we drove to the Geneva Motor Show one year. And we stopped at a services, I'm going to say it was in Switzerland. Maybe not. Anyway, it was a Marché. And I don't know if Marché is still at this level, but I remember walking into this services and there being just a cornucopia of like beautiful, freshly cooked food, juices in cups set into beds of ice. You could get a steak au poivre avec frites, which was actually really like cooked fresh right there.
Are you sure it wasn't in France? I suppose if you'd be going from Germany, why would you be in France if you're going to Switzerland?
Exactly. Anyway, the reason I thought this question was super, super interesting was because obviously you have a bunch of car companies who are talking about creating their own charging stations. You have the really interesting question of what happens to the retail footprint of oil majors over time with these spaces. And I think coming to the question of the car manufacturers owning these sorts of spaces, I mean, this is the kind of experience that historically has been, it's a cost that's been externalized by car manufacturers. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, actually, we want to control this experience. Now, I have no personal experience with how Porsche is doing it. I think Audi is doing it in some places. Mercedes-Benz has talked about wanting to do it.
It's doing it.
I mean, I have had experience of Tesla superchargers where you're just kind of like standing in a scabby backlot somewhere going,
I hope I'm not getting mugged in a minute.
Or in the Calabasas Mall wondering if I was going to see a Kardashian. Did not happen. But it does raise a really interesting question as to, okay, like how, if you're a car maker, like how are you going to brand this channel and how are you going to deliver that experience?
I tell you what, if Audi want to set up a restaurant that serves the kind of food they used to on the press days at motor shows, then as long as you'll let me charge my non-Audi vehicle there, I'm stopping there. I'm I'm a customer.
This is exactly my thought. Like if I could stop in for an early morning, like Weisswurst, pretzel, and maybe an alcohol-free Polana, I'd be cock a hoop. I mean, Porsche would naturally top it. For folk that are listening that don't know, once upon a time, when motor shows were actually a thing,
back in the good old days,
back in the good old days, the manufacturers would put on breakfast, lunch, and drinks. So typically, the way you wanted your day to run was to start at Audi because you could have beer for breakfast, along with a white sausage and a pretzel. Then you would go to Porsche, and depending on the niceness of the door people at Porsche, you would get in and you would have just an incredible lunch there. And if you couldn't do Porsche, then you'd go to Audi. And if you couldn't do Audi, if you're in...
they used to do a cracking lunch on the first day,
They did. And if you couldn't do Audi, if you're in Paris, you'd do PSA. Because PSA would actually do a half-decent lunch. And then you always wanted to finish at BMW because they had bottomless Veuve Clicquot.
Interspersed with coffee from De Matteo at Volvo.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay. This is not a branded message. Coffee and canelbulla from Gothenburg's very own Damateo. But I think when Michael asked the question at first, I was like, we're not going to talk about that. And then I thought, actually, this is genius because we are seeing car companies wanting to own more of this space and thinking through it from a customer experience and service design perspective. I imagine it's a whole new challenge for car makers who have typically outsourced the customer service aspect of their brand.
It's absolutely super interesting for that reason, and I think, as you say, we're in this world where petrol stations, gas stations are actually disappearing, or at least they are in Europe, because the oil majors don't actually make very much money out of selling gasoline. They make their money in the shop because you go in and you buy 2 bars of chocolate and a bottle of Coke. But your desire to dwell there is, how should we say, minimized and quick. At the same time, Tesla's just moving in, I think, particularly in the US, to the point where its supercharger network really comes into its own, and it's going to really start to reap the rewards of having invested in that and gain money back from it, from the charging costs that they're going to charge people. But there's no sort of experience built around it. And I think on top of this, if we link it back to the actual vehicle, we're in this race at the moment to make charging faster and faster and faster and faster. And I've talked about this before from my trip across Europe. The new Taycan, you can put, I think, 10 to 80% in it in something like 15 minutes. The charge curve is incredible. And we're on this race to make it so that a charge is as quick as filling up with fuel. I think there's an argument here to look at it another way and say, if you have a range of 300 to 400 miles, you don't want to really, or most people don't want to drive more than 800 miles a day. Where are you going to site places where you can charge a car while you stop for lunch? And you actually might be perfectly happy to leave it for 30 or 45 minutes. And I think it's a difficult one because it's many different use cases. You have that thing where everyone's going to just want to stop for lunch and then all the charges are full. But I do think what you're highlighting is there's an opportunity for the brands, if they're clever, to A, make money, and B, build an experience around the vehicle, which really starts to extend the brand beyond just the hump of metal.
Nice. Let's do it. Let's get stuck in. On that note, that's a wrap for episode 17 of Looking Out the Podcast. It's been a delight, as per usual, to have you with us. We will be back in 2 weeks with another show. But until then, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or
it's
Spotify.
Getting bolder.
Or,
if you like it.
If you like it, hit the subscribe button on YouTube. I'm trying to remember all the bloody things you meant to do as a content creator. It's really dull.
We've got to pre-record this bit, really.
This has been Looking Out the Podcast. My name is Drew Smith.
And my name is Joe Simpson.
Oh, this is Drew Smith. Thank you for listening.
What happened there?
No
your
idea.
name?
Yeah. Bye!
Oh dear.